The morning sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the Galactic Military Academy's main campus. Students from 12 different worlds walked the paths between buildings, their various forms creating a colorful mix of scales, fur, crystal, and flesh. Some floated above the ground, others walked on multiple legs, and a few moved with the grace of natural predators. Jake Morrison adjusted his standard academy uniform and checked his tablet for the third time. Military history with Professor Zethkari was his favorite class, though he often felt out of place among his alien classmates. At 19, he was one of the youngest cadets ever accepted to the academy. More importantly, he was the only human in his year. The classroom building rose before him like a crystal spire, its walls made of some transparent material that seemed to shift colors in the light. Jake had been on Kepler 442b for 8 months now, but the alien architecture still amazed him. Everything here was built to accommodate different species. High ceilings for the winged Silnathi, reinforced floors for the heavy Tornhai, and special lighting systems for species with different visual needs. Jake climbed the spiral ramp to the 3rd level. The academy didn't use stairs since many species couldn't climb them. As he walked, he passed a group of Kesahari cadets, their cat-like features animated as they discussed some tactical problem. They nodded politely to Jake as he passed. Most aliens at the academy were friendly enough, though they often seemed puzzled by human behavior. The classroom door recognized Jake's presence and slid open with a soft hiss. The room was large and circular, with seats arranged in terraced rows around a central platform. Jake's usual spot was in the back corner, where he could see everyone without drawing attention to himself. Other students were already arriving. Lyra KeThe, a Veltar cadet with natural armor plating covering her blue-gray skin, took her seat in the front row. She was always eager to participate in discussions and had strong opinions about military honor. Behind her sat the Florian, called Sage, whose plant-like body swayed gently even when sitting still. The Florians were peaceful by nature, but their ability to process multiple types of radiation made them valuable in space combat. River, the only Mindari in the class, chose a seat by herself near the middle. The telepathic species often isolated themselves to avoid the mental noise of other beings. Her pale, elongated features showed the strain of being surrounded by so many non-telepathic minds. The Keshari twins, Vel and Nyx, bounded into the room with typical feline energy. Their spotted fur was perfectly groomed, and their large ears twitched at every sound. They were some of the best pilots in the academy, their natural reflexes giving them an advantage in space combat simulations. 2 Tornhai cadets entered more, slowly, their rock-like bodies making each step deliberate. Ben and Stone, they had chosen human names for easier pronunciation, were incredibly strong, but moved at their own pace. Their species measured time differently than most others, thinking in terms of centuries rather than years. Professor Zethkari arrived exactly on time, as always. The Veltar instructor was older than most, his crystalline skin showing the deep blue color that came with age. His 4 arms moved independently as he arranged his materials on the central platform. Like all Veltar, he stood nearly 7 feet tall and spoke with a voice that seemed to come from multiple sources. "Good morning, cadets," Professor Zethkari began, his words echoing slightly in the chamber. "Today we continue our study of ancient warfare tactics across known species. Last week we discussed the evolution of space combat. Today, we will examine how different species conducted warfare before they reached the stars." Jake opened his tablet and prepared to take notes. This was always an interesting topic, though it sometimes made him uncomfortable. Human history contained some very dark chapters that he preferred not to think about. War, the professor continued, is unfortunately a common element in the development of most sentient species. How a civilization conducts warfare often reveals fundamental aspects of their nature, their values, and their understanding of honor. Lyra raised one of her armored hands. Professor, you mentioned honor. Do all species develop similar concepts of honorable combat? An excellent question, Cadet KeThe. No, they do not. Each species develops warfare in ways that reflect their biology, their environment, and their cultural values. For example, your own people, the Veltar, developed very formal rules for combat due to your natural armor and long lifespans. Jake watched as several students nodded. The Veltar were known throughout the galaxy for their military traditions and codes of honor. Their wars were fought like elaborate duels, with specific rules about acceptable weapons and tactics. The Silnathi, Professor Zethkari gestured toward two winged cadets near the window, developed aerial combat that emphasized speed and precision. Their wars were often decided by single battles between champion flyers. One of the Silnathi, whose name Jake couldn't pronounce, spread her wings slightly in acknowledgement. Her feathers shimmered with a metallic sheen that indicated high status in her society. Each species brought their natural advantages to warfare, the professor continued. The Tornhai used their strength and patience for siege warfare. The Mindari fought with psychic abilities. The Keshari relied on pack tactics and superior reflexes. Jake shifted in his seat. He knew where this discussion was heading, and it always made him nervous. Professor Zethkari had a way of asking unexpected questions, and Jake had been lucky so far to avoid detailed discussions about human military history. What makes this topic particularly interesting, Professor Zethkari said, his crystalline features reflecting the room's light, is how these ancient warfare methods shaped each species' approach to modern conflict. Understanding the historical context helps us work together more effectively in the Galactic Defense Force. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of students taking notes. Jake found himself staring at his tablet without really seeing it. He was thinking about his grandfather's stories, the ones his family didn't like to talk about. Stories about wars that were very different from the honorable duels and formal battles that other species described. Next week, Professor Zethkari announced, we will have a special discussion session. I want each of you to be prepared to share something about your species' ancient warfare traditions. Think about what those traditions reveal about your people's values and character. Jake's stomach dropped. He had been dreading something like this. While other species talked about honor duels and formal combat, human warfare history was much darker, much more brutal, much more difficult to explain to beings who fought with codes of honor and respect for non-combatants. As the class ended and students began filing out, Jake remained in his seat. He watched his classmates chatting excitedly about the assignment, already planning what stories they would share about their heroic ancestors and noble warrior traditions. Jake finally stood and gathered his things. He had a week to figure out how to explain human warfare to beings who had never experienced anything like it. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. The week passed too quickly for Jake's comfort. He spent his free time in the Academy library, reading about the warfare traditions of other species, hoping to find some way to make human history sound less brutal. But everything he read only made the contrast worse. When the day of the special discussion arrived, Jake entered the classroom with heavy steps. His classmates were already there, chatting excitedly about the stories they planned to share. Professor Zethkari was arranging, his materials at the center platform, his 4 arms moving in their usual precise patterns. "Today should be quite enlightening," Professor Zethkari began once everyone was seated. "We will hear from each species about their ancient warfare traditions. Let us begin with the Veltar, since we have the most representatives from that species." Lyra KeThe stood immediately, her armored form catching the light. "Professor, I would be honored to speak for my people." She moved to the center of the room with the confident stride of a natural warrior. "The Veltar have always fought with honor," Lyra began, her voice strong and clear. "Our ancient wars followed strict rules. Before any battle, both sides would meet to agree on acceptable weapons, the treatment of prisoners, and the protection of non-combatants. We believed that how you fought was more important than whether you won." Jake listened as Lyra described formal duels between champions, battles that stopped at sunset so the wounded could be cared for, and wars where entire planets remained untouched because they contained sacred sites or civilian populations. "Our greatest ancient war was the War of 3 Suns," Lyra continued. "It lasted 40 years, but fewer than 10,000 warriors died in total. Both sides fought with such honor that when it ended, the losing side was given equal representation in the new government." Professor Zethkari nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Cadet KeThe. A perfect example of how warfare can reflect a species' values. Who would like to speak next?" One of the Silnathi cadets, whose name sounded like wind through crystal, glided to the center. Her wings were partially spread, a sign of respect in her culture. "The Silnathi fought in the sky," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality. "Our ancient wars were aerial battles between individual pilots. Each warrior flew alone, with weapons designed for precision rather than destruction. A single well-placed shot could disable an enemy without killing them." She described battles that looked like deadly dances in the sky, with complex rules about pursuit and surrender. Silnathi warriors who were shot down and survived were considered to have fought with honor, regardless of which side won. "Our most famous battle involved 300 pilots from each side," the Silnathi continued. "They fought for 6 hours, above the cloud cities of Venthara. When it ended, only 12 pilots had died. But everyone agreed it was the most beautiful battle ever fought." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Beautiful battles, honorable defeats, rules that protected civilians. How could he possibly explain human warfare after stories like these? Ben, one of the Torn High cadets, spoke next. His rock-like voice rumbled through the room as he described siege warfare that lasted for decades, but where both sides agreed to let supply ships through to feed non-combatants. Torn High wars were slow and methodical, with plenty of time for negotiation and peaceful resolution. River, the Mindari, shared stories of psychic duels where telepaths fought in mental landscapes, careful to avoid permanent damage to each other's minds. Even their mental warfare had rules about what areas of consciousness were off-limits. The Keshari twins tag-teamed their presentation, describing pack hunts that had evolved into tactical warfare. Their ancient battles were fast and decisive, but they always offered surrender terms and never fought during breeding seasons. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes: honor, rules, protection of the innocent, respect for the enemy. Jake realized that while these species had all experienced war, none of them had ever experienced anything like what humans called war. Professor Zethkari looked around the room with satisfaction. "Excellent presentations, all of you. We can see how each species' natural characteristics shaped their approach to conflict. The Veltar's armor led to formal dueling traditions. The Silnathi's flight ability created aerial combat cultures. The Tornhai's patience resulted in strategic siege warfare." Jake realized with growing dread that he was the only one who hadn't spoken yet. The professor's crystalline gaze was turning toward his corner of the room. "Now then," Professor Zethkari said, "we come to our human representative. Cadet Morrison, your species is relatively new to the galactic community, but surely you have some interesting warfare traditions to share." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jake, who felt like he was shrinking into his chair. His classmates looked at him with friendly curiosity, expecting another story of honorable combat and noble warriors. Jake cleared his throat and stood slowly. His legs felt unsteady as he walked to the center of the room. The circle of alien faces around him looked so innocent, so unprepared for what human warfare actually looked like. "Human warfare," Jake began, then stopped. How could he even start? How could he explain the Industrial Revolution and how it changed killing from a personal act to a mass production process? "Take your time, Cadet Morrison," Professor Zethkari encouraged. "We are all eager to learn about human military traditions." Jake looked around the room one more time, at Lyra, who believed in honor above all else, at the Silnathi, whose people fought beautiful battles, at River, whose species fought without permanent harm, at all of them, waiting to hear about another. "Noble warrior culture?" "Humans," Jake said quietly, "developed a very different approach to warfare." The room was completely still. Even the Florian named Sage had stopped his gentle swaying. Jake realized there was no way to make this gentle, no way to ease them into it. Human warfare was unlike anything these species had ever imagined. "We didn't fight with honor codes," Jake continued, his voice getting stronger but colder. "We didn't have rules about protecting civilians. We didn't stop fighting at sunset to care for the wounded." He could see confusion starting to appear on alien faces. They didn't understand yet, but they were beginning to sense that something was wrong. "Humans," Jake said, "turned warfare into a science. We studied how to kill each other more efficiently. We built entire economies around it, and we got very, very good at it." The first look of alarm appeared on Lyra's armored features. She was beginning to understand that this story wasn't going to be like the others. Jake stood in the center of the classroom, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes on him. The silence stretched uncomfortably as his classmates waited for him to continue. He could see their expectant faces, still hoping for a story that would fit with everything they had heard so far. "I need you to understand something first," Jake said, his voice steady but quiet. "Everything you've shared today, the honor duels, the aerial dances, the siege warfare with supply lines for civilians, humans never developed anything like that." Professor Zethkari's crystalline features shifted slightly, showing confusion. "Surely, Cadet Morrison, even the most aggressive species develop some form of combat etiquette. Rules of engagement, protection for non-combatants, codes of honor among warriors." Jake shook his head slowly. "No, Professor. We didn't." He could see the disbelief on their faces. Lyra leaned forward in her seat, her armor plates shifting with a soft metallic sound. "But that's impossible! How can you have organized warfare without rules, without honor?" "That's what I'm trying to explain," Jake said. Human warfare wasn't about honor. It was about winning by any means necessary. The Silnathi cadet who had spoken earlier spread her wings nervously. But surely your warriors fought with some sense of nobility? Some respect for worthy opponents. Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to begin. These beings lived in a universe where war had rules, where enemies could respect each other, where civilians were protected. They had no framework for understanding what humans had done to each other. Let me tell you about the first human war that involved multiple nations, Jake began. We called it the First World War, though at the time we just called it the Great War because we thought nothing could ever be worse. He started with the basics, the alliance system that turned a small conflict into a global war. His classmates listened with growing confusion as he described how human nations had dragged their colonies and dependencies into a fight that had nothing to do with them. The war began in 1914, Jake continued. By the time it ended 4 years. Later, over 15 million people were dead. A gasp went up from several students. River, the Mindari, pressed her hands to her temples. 15 million? In 4 years? That's impossible. No species could sustain those losses. Humans could, Jake said grimly, and did. But the numbers aren't the worst part. It's how they died. He described the trenches, long lines of holes, dug in the mud, where soldiers lived like animals for months at a time. The space between opposing trenches was called No Man's Land, a wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and rotting corpses. Wait, Lyra interrupted, her voice strained. You're saying they fought from holes in the ground? How is that honorable? Combat? It wasn't, Jake replied. Honor wasn't the point. Killing the enemy was the point. He continued with machine guns that could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, cutting down entire formations of advancing soldiers. Artillery shells that could be heard from 100 miles away, turning the battlefield into a hellscape of mud and blood. But surely, one of the Tornhai said, his rocky voice uncertain. They had rules about weapons. Some things were forbidden. Jake's laugh was bitter. They tried. The humans signed treaties banning certain weapons. Then they broke those treaties when it was convenient. He told them about poison gas, clouds of death that drifted across the battlefield, choking soldiers in their trenches. Chemical weapons that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. Weapons designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum suffering. The classroom was dead silent now. Several students looked physically ill. Sage, the Florian, had turned a sickly yellow color that Jake had never seen before. This is just one war, Jake continued, his voice growing harder. Humans fought thousands of wars, and each time we got better at killing each other. Professor Zethkari finally found his voice. Cadet Morrison, surely you're exaggerating. No civilization could survive such barbarism. We not only survived it, Jake said, we industrialized it. He moved on to World War II, starting with the basic facts. A war that involved every major nation on Earth, lasting 6 years and killing between 50 and 80 million people. Historians still weren't sure of the exact number because so many civilians died that they couldn't be counted. Civilians? River whispered, her telepathic abilities picking up Jake's emotions. You targeted non-combatants? We didn't just target them, Jake said. We made them the primary targets. The aliens stared at him in horror as he described the deliberate bombing of cities, designed not to hit military targets, but to break the enemy's will to fight by killing their families. Entire cities turned to ash in single nights. Civilians burned alive in their homes. But why? Lyra asked, her warrior's training unable to comprehend the concept. Where is the honor in killing those who cannot fight back? There was no honor, Jake repeated. We abandoned honor. We decided that anything that helped us win was acceptable. He described the systematic murder of entire populations, industrial facilities designed specifically to kill human beings as efficiently as possible. Gas chambers disguised as showers, mass graves that stretched for miles. The methodical extermination of millions of people based on their race, religion, or political beliefs. The Keshari twins were now huddled together, their feline features showing pure distress. Ben and Stone, the Tornhigh, had gone completely, still in the way their species did when deeply disturbed. You're describing genocide, Professor Zethkari said, his forearms trembling slightly. The deliberate extermination of entire populations. That's not warfare. That's something else entirely. For humans, Jake said quietly, it became the same thing. He could see that he was losing them, that their minds were rejecting what he was telling them. It was too far outside their experience, too alien to their understanding of how intelligent beings behaved. I know this is hard to believe, Jake said, but I'm not finished. The wars I've described happened in just 30 years, and they weren't the worst things humans did to each other. The room was so quiet now that Jake could hear the air circulation system humming in the walls. His classmates looked like they were in shock, their various features showing distress in ways unique to each species. How many more stories are there? Sage asked, his plant-like voice barely audible. Jake thought about the Korean War, Vietnam, the countless proxy conflicts of the Cold War, the genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia, the ongoing conflicts that seemed to never end. Hundreds, he said simply. We've been fighting continuously for our entire recorded history, and each time we found new ways to make it worse. The silence in the classroom was heavy and uncomfortable. Jake could see his classmates struggling to process what he had told them. Their faces showed confusion, horror, and something else, a growing fear that they were beginning to understand what humans were truly capable of. Professor Zethkari was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. Cadet Morrison, I think perhaps we should move on to another topic. This discussion has become quite intense. No, Jake said firmly, surprising himself with his own determination. You asked about human warfare traditions. You wanted to understand how ancient conflicts shaped our approach to modern combat. If I stop now, you'll never really understand humans at all. Lyra shifted in her seat, her armor plates clicking softly. But surely these were exceptions, aberrations in human behavior? You can't be saying that all human warfare was like this. Jake looked at her directly. I'm saying it was worse than this, much worse. He could see River, the Mindari, pressing her hands harder against her temples. Her telepathic abilities were picking up his emotions, and the weight of human history was overwhelming her sensitive mind. Are you all right? Jake asked her. River looked up with pale, strained features. The pain in your thoughts, she whispered. The guilt, the shame. You carry all of this inside you? Every human does, Jake replied. We learn about these things in school. We study them so we'll never repeat them. But how do you function? River asked. How do you live with such knowledge? Jake was quiet for a moment. Because we have to. Because forgetting would be worse than remembering. Professor Zethkari cleared his throat, his crystalline features showing deep concern. Perhaps we could focus on more recent human history? Surely your species developed more civilized approaches. To conflict over time? Jake's laugh was bitter. You would think so, wouldn't you? But humans kept finding new ways to make warfare more terrible. He began describing the Cold War. Two human superpowers facing each other across a divided world, each armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy their entire planet multiple times over. The concept of mutually assured destruction, where peace was maintained only by the promise that any war would end in the complete annihilation of both sides. You built weapons that could destroy your own world? One of the Silnathi asked, her wings fluttering with distress. Why would any species create such things? Because we were afraid of each other, Jake explained. And the best way to make sure your enemy couldn't kill you was to make sure you could kill them even worse. He described proxy wars fought in, distant countries, where the superpowers armed different sides and let them fight to avoid direct confrontation. Millions of people died in conflicts that had nothing to do with their own interests, simply because they were caught between competing human powers. The Tornhai cadet named Stone spoke up, his rocky voice slow and confused. But if these weapons were so terrible, surely both sides would agree to destroy them, to choose peace over mutual destruction. You would think so, Jake said, but humans kept building more weapons, bigger weapons, deadlier weapons. At one point, we had over 60,000 nuclear warheads pointed at each other. The number was too large for most of his classmates to comprehend. They lived in a galaxy where wars were fought between small groups of warriors, where a battle involving a few hundred combatants was considered massive. 60,000, Sage repeated slowly, his plant-like features showing deep distress. Each one capable of destroying a city? Much more than a city, Jake corrected. Each one could destroy an area the size of several Veltar territories, and we kept them ready to launch at a moment's notice for decades. Lyra stood up abruptly, her armor clanking. This is impossible. No rational species would behave this way. You're describing civilization ending insanity. Yes, Jake agreed simply. That's exactly what it was. Professor Zethkari was frantically making notes on his tablet, his forearms moving independently. I need to understand the scale here, Cadet Morrison. When you say 60,000 weapons, you're talking about the entire human species across multiple planets? No, Professor, Jake said quietly. This was just on Earth, before we reached the stars, before we even had colonies on our own moon. The room erupted in shocked voices as his classmates finally grasped the true scale of what Jake was describing. These weren't wars fought across star systems by multiple civilizations. This was a single species, on a single planet, threatening to destroy itself. But how did you survive? The Keshari twin named Vel asked, her feline voice high with distress. How did your civilization continue to exist? Barely, Jake admitted. We came very close to ending ourselves several times. There were moments when the only thing that prevented global nuclear war was the decision of a single human being. He described the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days when the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The story of Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer who chose not to report what appeared to be incoming American missiles, preventing a retaliatory strike that would have started global nuclear war. One person, River whispered. The survival of your entire species depended on one person's decision? Multiple times, Jake confirmed. And we didn't even know about most of them until years later. The aliens stared at him in stunned silence. They were beginning to understand that humans weren't just another warrior species with a different combat tradition. They were something entirely outside the galactic community's experience. Professor Zethkari set down his tablet with trembling hands. Cadet Morrison, I think I need to ask you a direct question. Given this history, given these capabilities, why did the Galactic Council allow humans to join our alliance? Why aren't other species afraid of you? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. This was the heart of it, the question that every alien who learned about human history eventually asked. Because, he said finally, we learned. Learned what? Lyra demanded. We learned what we were capable of, Jake replied. And we learned to be afraid of ourselves. He could see that this answer confused them even more. How could fear of their own capabilities lead to peace? I'm not explaining this well, Jake said, running a hand through his hair. Let me try again. Humans didn't become peaceful because we evolved beyond violence. We became peaceful because we became so good at violence that it terrified us. River looked up at him with her large, dark eyes. The weight in your mind, she said softly. It's not just guilt about the past. It's fear of the future. Jake nodded. Every human grows up learning these stories. We know exactly what we're capable of when we lose control. And that knowledge shapes everything we do. Professor Zethkari leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the classroom lights. So, human peace is based on fear of human war? In part, Jake agreed. But it's more than that. We learned that the only way to prevent these horrors from happening again was to build something better. To create systems and institutions that could resolve conflicts without violence. He could see his classmates struggling with this concept. To them, peace was natural, and war was aberrant. They couldn't understand a species that had to actively work to prevent itself from self-destruction. That's why humans are so good at diplomacy now, Jake continued. Not because we're naturally peaceful, but because we know exactly what happens when diplomacy fails. Jake could see that his explanation wasn't helping his classmates understand. If anything, they looked more confused and disturbed than before. The concept of a species that had to actively prevent itself from committing atrocities was completely alien to their experience. I can see you don't believe me, Jake said. Or maybe you think I'm exaggerating. Let me give you some specific examples of what human warfare actually looked like. Professor Zethkari held up one of his crystalline hands. Cadet Morrison, perhaps we should schedule a separate session for this discussion. I'm concerned about the impact on your fellow students. No, Lyra said firmly, her warrior's instincts overriding her discomfort. If we're going to work alongside humans in the Galactic Defense Force, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Continue, Jake. Jake was surprised by her use of his first name. In all their months together, she had always been formally correct, addressing him as Cadet Morrison. The shift suggested that something fundamental had changed in how she saw him. All right, Jake said. Let me tell you about Vietnam. He started with the basics, a civil war in a small Southeast Asian country that became a proxy conflict between human superpowers. What should have been a local dispute escalated into a massive war involving millions of soldiers and lasting over a decade. The Americans sent over 2 million soldiers to fight in a war that had nothing to do with their own territory or people, Jake explained. The Vietnamese were fighting for their independence, but they became pawns in a larger conflict between competing ideologies. The Tornhai cadet named Ben spoke up, his rocky voice confused. But why would warriors fight in a conflict that didn't involve their own territory? Where is the honor in fighting someone else's war? There was no honor, Jake repeated. It was about politics and ideology and fear. The Americans were afraid that if one small country became communist, it would spread to other countries. So they decided to fight a war to prevent that. He described the technology used in Vietnam, helicopters that could rain death from above, napalm that burned entire forests to deny cover to the enemy, chemical weapons designed to strip all vegetation from the landscape. You destroyed the environment? Sage asked, his plant-like features showing deep distress. You poisoned the very ground you were fighting over? We called it defoliation, Jake said. The idea was to remove the jungle so the enemy couldn't hide in it. We sprayed millions of gallons of chemical herbicides over the country. River, the Mindari, was now openly weeping. Her telepathic abilities were picking up Jake's emotions as he remembered these stories, and the weight of human cruelty was overwhelming her sensitive mind. The chemicals didn't just kill plants, Jake continued. They caused cancer, birth defects, and other health problems that lasted for generations. Children are still being born with deformities decades later because of what we did to that land. The Silnathi cadet who had spoken earlier folded her wings tightly against her body, a sign of extreme distress in her species. You poisoned the unborn? Children who had nothing to do with the war? Unintentionally, Jake said. But yes. And when we found out what the chemicals were doing, we kept using them anyway because they were militarily effective. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could see his classmates looking at him with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They were beginning to understand that human warfare wasn't just more violent than their own traditions. It was fundamentally different in ways that challenged their understanding of civilized behavior. Professor Zethkari's voice was barely above a whisper. How many wars like this did humans fight? Dozens, Jake replied. Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. The list goes on, and those were just the big ones that involved major powers. There were hundreds of smaller conflicts happening simultaneously. He described the Iran-Iraq War, where two human nations fought for 8 years, using chemical weapons, child soldiers, and human wave attacks that left over 1 million people dead. The Rwanda genocide, where nearly 1 million people were murdered. In 100 days, most of them killed with simple hand tools. Hand tools? Vel, one of the Keshari twins, asked weakly. Machetes, mostly, Jake said. The killers wanted to make it personal. They wanted to look their victims in the eye as they died. Nix, the other Keshari twin, made a sound that might have been retching. Their species valued quick, clean kills, even when hunting for food. The idea of deliberately prolonging suffering was incomprehensible to them. Stop, River said suddenly, her voice breaking. Please stop. I can feel your pain, your shame, your guilt. How do you carry all of this? How does any human function with this knowledge? Jake looked at her with sympathy. I'm sorry, River. I know this is hard for you to experience secondhand, but you asked to understand human warfare traditions. This is what they were. Were? Lyra asked, seizing on the past tense. You're saying humans no longer fight wars like this? Not exactly, Jake said carefully. We still have conflicts, but we've learned to be more careful about how we conduct them. We have international laws now, rules about protecting civilians and prisoners of war. Do you follow these laws? Professor Zethkari asked. Jake was quiet for a moment. Usually, not always. We're still human. The admission hung in the air like a confession. His classmates were realizing that everything Jake had described wasn't ancient history from humanity's primitive past. These were recent events, well within the memory of people still alive. "When did these wars end?" Sage asked. "They didn't," Jake said simply. "There are human conflicts happening right now, even as we sit here. We've gotten better at limiting them, but we haven't stopped fighting entirely." The room erupted in shocked voices as his classmates realized that humans were currently engaged in warfare while simultaneously being members of the peaceful Galactic Alliance. "But that's impossible," Lyra protested. "The Alliance Charter requires all member species to resolve conflicts through peaceful means." "And we do," Jake said, "when we're dealing with other species. But we still have trouble applying those same standards to conflicts among ourselves." Professor Zethkari was making frantic notes again, his 4 arms working independently. "This explains so much about human behavior in the Alliance. Your insistence on strong conflict resolution mechanisms, your advocacy for preventive diplomacy, your reluctance to commit to military actions." "We know what happens when diplomacy fails," Jake confirmed. "We've seen it too many times." "But how do other species trust you?" Ben asked. "If humans are still fighting wars among themselves, how? Can we be sure you won't turn that violence on us?" Jake considered the question carefully. It was something he had wondered about himself when he first learned that Earth was joining the Galactic Alliance. "Because," he said finally, "we're more afraid of ourselves than you are of us." The statement confused his classmates even more. How could self-fear lead to trustworthiness? "Every human military officer learns about these wars in detail," Jake explained. "We study them not to celebrate them, but to understand how normal, rational people can commit such atrocities. We learn about the factors that lead to escalation, the warning signs of impending violence, the ways that good intentions can go horribly wrong." River looked up at him with streaming eyes. "You study your own evil?" "Constantly," Jake confirmed. "It's the only way we know to prevent it from happening again." Jake could see that his classmates were reaching their emotional limits. River was openly crying, the Keshari twins were huddled together in distress, and even the normally stoic Tornhai looked shaken. But he wasn't finished. They needed to understand the full scope of human capacity for violence if they were ever going to truly understand humans at all. "There's something else you need to know," Jake said quietly. "Something that might help explain why the Galactic Council decided to trust humanity despite our history." Professor Zethkari looked up from his notes with weary eyes. "What could possibly make this situation more understandable?" Jake reached up and slowly rolled back the sleeve of his academy uniform, exposing his right forearm. At first, his classmates saw nothing unusual. Just pale human skin with the typical scattering of small scars and marks that all active beings accumulated over time. But then Jake pointed to a small dark spot near his wrist. It was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Just a tiny discoloration that could have been anything. "This is a blood stain," Jake said simply. The room went completely silent. His classmates stared at the small mark with confusion and growing unease. "It's from my grandfather's uniform," Jake continued. "He fought in what we called the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. He was 19 years old when he landed on a beach called Iwo Jima, where over 6,000 Americans and 21,000 Japanese died in 36 days of fighting." Jake's voice was steady, but River could feel the deep emotion behind his words. The pain, the grief, the weight of inherited trauma. "When my grandfather came home from the war, he tried to wash the blood out of his uniform. But this one stain wouldn't come out," He kept the uniform in a box in his closet for 60 years, and when he died, he left it to my father with specific instructions. What instructions? Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. To preserve the stain, Jake said. To pass it down to the next generation as a reminder. Professor Zethkari's crystalline features were completely still. A reminder of what? Of what humans are capable of when we forget to be afraid of ourselves, Jake replied. He explained how his grandfather had taken a piece of fabric from the uniform and had it embedded under his own skin, and how his father had done the same when he reached adulthood. Jake had received his own implant on his 18th birthday, just before leaving Earth for the Academy. You carry the blood of war in your own body? Sage asked, his plant-like features showing deep disturbance. Every member of my family does, Jake confirmed. And we're not the only ones. Millions of human families have similar traditions. We carry physical reminders of our capacity for violence. River looked up at him with tear-streaked eyes. The pain in your mind makes sense now. You don't just know about these wars intellectually. You carry them with you always. Jake nodded. This stain is from a man who killed other humans with his bare hands, who watched his friends die in ways too horrible to describe, who came home broken and spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what he had experienced. But why? Vel asked. Why would you want to remember such things? Why not let the past remain in the past? Because, Jake said, the moment we forget what we're capable of is the moment we become capable of it again. He began to describe how his grandfather's war had affected not just him, but his children and grandchildren, how the trauma had been passed down through generations, creating a family legacy of vigilance against human violence. My grandfather never talked about the war, Jake continued, but he made sure we understood the cost. He made sure we knew that the freedoms we enjoyed were bought with other people's blood, and he made sure we understood that it could all happen again if we stopped being careful. Professor Zethkari was beginning to understand. So human peace isn't based on natural pacifism, but on deliberate remembrance of the consequences of war. Exactly, Jake said. We're not peaceful because we don't know how to fight. We're peaceful because we know exactly how to fight, and we're terrified of what happens when we do. Lyra stood up suddenly, her armor clanking. But this is extraordinary. You're describing a species that has institutionalized self-awareness of its own capacity for evil. No other species in the galaxy has anything like this. That's why the Galactic Council ultimately decided to trust us, Jake explained. Not because we're harmless, but because we're more aware of our own dangers than anyone else could be. He described how human applicants for the Galactic Defense Force underwent extensive psychological evaluation, not to screen out violent tendencies, but to ensure they understood and could control them. How human military doctrine emphasized de-escalation and civilian protection, not out of natural inclination, but through deliberate training and constant vigilance. We have safeguards, Jake said. Multiple layers of them, rules and regulations, and oversight systems all designed to prevent humans from reverting to our historical patterns. Do they work? Ben asked. Jake was quiet for a moment. Usually, not always. We're still human. The admission was sobering. His classmates were beginning to understand that working with humans meant working with beings who were inherently dangerous, but trying very hard not to be. So when humans serve in the Galactic Defense Force, Professor Zethkari said slowly, they bring not just their tactical knowledge, but their understanding of how to prevent conflicts from escalating. That's the idea, Jake confirmed. We know all the warning signs because we've seen them before. We know how quickly situations can spiral out of control because we've lived through it. And we know how to build systems that prevent violence because we've had to learn. River wiped her eyes and looked at him with something approaching understanding. The weight you carry isn't just guilt about the past. It's responsibility for the future. Jake nodded. Every human in a position of authority knows that they could potentially make decisions that lead to massive suffering. We carry that knowledge with us always. Is that why human diplomats are so effective? Lyra asked. Because they understand the true cost of failure? Partly, Jake said. But it's also because we understand how conflicts start. We know the patterns, the escalation cycles, the ways that small disagreements can become existential threats. We've seen it happen too many times. The Silnathi cadet spoke up for the first time in several minutes. So human peace is maintained through constant vigilance against human war? Yes, Jake said simply. We can never relax. We can never assume that we've evolved beyond our nature. The moment we stop being afraid of ourselves is the moment we become dangerous again. The room was quiet as his classmates absorbed this information. They were beginning to understand that humans weren't just another species with a violent past. They were something unique in the galaxy. A species that had achieved peace not through evolution or natural temperament, but through conscious, deliberate effort maintained across generations. The bloodstain, Professor Zethkari said quietly. It's not a trophy. No, Jake confirmed. It's a warning. The classroom remained in stunned silence as Jake slowly rolled his sleeve back down, covering the bloodstain. His classmates stared at him with a mixture of horror, fascination, and something approaching respect. They were beginning to understand that they had never really known him at all. Professor Zethkari was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. Cadet Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. Given everything you've shared with us today, how should the galaxy view humanity's role in the Galactic Defense Force? Jake considered the question carefully. It was something he had wondered about himself during his months at the Academy. How could species who fought with honor codes and protection for civilians work alongside beings whose warfare traditions included genocide and weapons of mass destruction? You should view us as what we are, Jake said finally. Dangerous beings who are trying very hard not to be dangerous. But how can we trust that? Lyra asked, her warrior's instincts clearly struggling with what she had learned. How can we be sure that humans won't revert to these behaviors under stress? Jake looked directly at her. You can't be sure, and neither can we. That's why we have safeguards. He began to explain the complex system of checks and balances that governed human participation in galactic affairs. Psychological monitoring, ethical oversight, and mandatory rotation policies that prevented any human from holding critical positions for too long. Every human officer in the Galactic Defense Force undergoes regular evaluation, Jake continued. Not just for competence, but for signs of stress, anger, or other emotional states that could lead to poor decisions. River looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. You monitor your own minds? Constantly, Jake confirmed. We know that good people can do terrible things under the right circumstances. We've seen it happen too many times to trust anyone completely, including ourselves. The Tornhai cadet named Stone spoke up, his rocky voice thoughtful. So human reliability comes not from natural goodness, but from systematic self-doubt? In a way, yes, Jake said. We assume that any human, under sufficient pressure, could potentially make catastrophic decisions. So we build systems that don't rely on individual virtue. Professor Zethkari was frantically taking notes again. This explains so much about human behavior in the Alliance. Your insistence on redundant command structures, your advocacy for civilian oversight of military operations, your reluctance to grant emergency powers even in crisis situations. We know what happens when good people are given too much power and too little oversight, Jake said grimly. We've seen democracies become dictatorships overnight when the right pressures are applied. Sage, the Florian, had been quiet for most of the discussion, but now he spoke up. You're describing a species that has lost faith in its own nature. Jake shook his head. Not lost faith, gained wisdom. We learned to distrust our own impulses because our impulses led us to commit atrocities. But surely, one of the Silnathi said, some humans are naturally peaceful, some must be trustworthy without constant monitoring. Maybe, Jake admitted. But we can't know who they are until they're tested under extreme stress, and by then, it's too late. He described the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students assigned to play guards in a mock prison began abusing their power within days. The Milgram experiments, where normal people administered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. Good people, Jake said, can do evil things. We proved that experimentally, multiple times. The aliens looked horrified as Jake described how researchers had deliberately tested the limits of human morality, finding that most people could be induced to commit harmful acts under relatively mild pressure. You experimented on your own ethics? River asked, her telepathic abilities picking up Jake's deep discomfort with the subject. We had to understand how normal people become monsters, Jake explained. Because if we didn't understand it, we couldn't prevent it. Lyra stood up and began pacing, her armor clanking with each step. This is unprecedented. You're describing a species that has scientifically studied its own capacity for evil, and found it to be far greater than we wanted to believe, Jake confirmed. He continued with more recent examples, how social media had revealed humanity's capacity for mob behavior, how economic pressure could turn neighbors against each other, how political polarization could make ordinary people support violence against their perceived enemies. Even now, Jake said, even with all our safeguards and self-awareness, humans continue to find new ways to hurt each other. We adapt our cruelty faster than we can build systems to prevent it. Professor Zethkari set down his tablet with trembling hands. But if this is true, if humans are so inherently dangerous, why did the Galactic Council accept your species into the Alliance? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something that he wasn't sure he fully understood himself. Because, he said finally, we're the only species that knows what we are. The statement confused his classmates. They looked at him with blank expressions, not understanding what he meant. Every other species in the galaxy believes in their own fundamental goodness, Jake continued. You all have honor codes and ethical systems that you trust completely. You believe that your people would never commit atrocities because it's not in your nature. He could see them nodding in agreement. Of course they believed in their own goodness. Why wouldn't they? But humans know better, Jake said. We know that good people can become monsters under the right circumstances. We know that ethical systems can be corrupted. We know that honor codes can be perverted to justify terrible acts. Lyra stopped pacing and stared at him. You're saying that human evil makes you more trustworthy than species that are naturally good? I'm saying that human awareness of our evil makes us more reliable than species that are unaware of their potential for evil, Jake corrected. River looked up at him with sudden understanding. You're the Watchers. You monitor not just yourselves, but the potential for conflict between other species. Jake nodded. We look for the warning signs that other species might miss. The escalation patterns, the dehumanization processes, the breakdown of ethical constraints. We've seen it all before. That's why human mediators are so effective, Professor Zethkari said with growing comprehension. You understand how conflicts develop because you've lived through them. And that's why human tactical advisors are so valuable, Lyra added. You can anticipate enemy behavior because you understand how beings think when they abandon moral constraints. Jake nodded grimly. We know how to fight dirty because we've fought dirty. We know how to prevent escalation because we've lived through escalation. We know how to build peace because we've experienced the full cost of war. The room was quiet as his classmates absorbed this information. They were beginning to understand that humanity's value to the Galactic Alliance wasn't despite their violent history, but because of it. So humans serve as what? Sage asked. A early warning system for the rest of the galaxy? Among other things, Jake confirmed. We're the species that knows what everyone is capable of, including ourselves. And we're committed to making sure it never happens. Because you carry the bloodstains, River said softly. Jake touched his covered forearm unconsciously. Because we carry the bloodstains. Professor Zethkari looked around the classroom at his students' faces, some showing shock, others deep thought, and a few displaying what could only be described as a new kind of respect mixed with wariness. He had been teaching military history for over 2 decades, but nothing had prepared him for this discussion. I think, the professor said slowly, we need to take a break. This has been intense. As his classmates began to gather their things, Jake noticed that none of them were looking directly at him. The easy camaraderie that had existed before was gone, replaced by something more complex and uncertain. Lyra was the first to approach him as students filed out of the classroom. Her armored form moved with its usual confidence, but Jake could see uncertainty in her crystalline eyes. Jake, she said, using his first name again, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. All right, Jake replied, though he dreaded what was coming. When you look at us, at me, at Sage, at the others, do you see potential enemies? Do you analyze how you would fight us if necessary? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer truthfully without making things worse than they already were. Yes, he said finally. I do. Every human does. It's automatic. Lyra's armor plates shifted slightly, a sign of distress in her species. I thought so. I can see it in your eyes sometimes. The way you watch us move, the way you note our capabilities. It's not personal, Jake said quickly. It's not because I don't trust you or consider you a friend. It's because I'm human, and humans are trained from childhood to assess threats. Even friends can become threats under the right circumstances, Lyra said, repeating back his earlier lesson. Especially friends, Jake confirmed sadly, because they know your weaknesses. River approached them, her telepathic abilities making her movements cautious around Jake's turbulent emotions. The weight in your mind, she said softly. It's not just the past, is it? You're constantly calculating, constantly preparing for conflicts that might never happen. Jake nodded. Every human military officer is. We run scenarios in our heads, constantly. How would we defend this position? How would we evacuate these civilians? How would we stop an ally who turned hostile? The Keshari twins, Vel and Nyx, had been listening from nearby. Now they approached with their characteristic feline curiosity overcoming their earlier distress. Is that why human tactical doctrine is so paranoid? Vel asked. All those redundant systems and backup plans? We plan for failure, Jake confirmed. We assume that everything that can go wrong will go wrong, usually at the worst possible moment. Because it has, Nyx added, understanding, dawning in her large eyes. Because it has, Jake agreed. Professor Zethkari finished packing his materials and walked over to the small group of students still gathered around Jake. Cadet Morrison, the professor said, I owe you an apology. When I assigned this presentation, I expected to hear about honor duels and territorial disputes. I had no idea we would be discussing what we discussed today. It's all right, Professor, Jake replied. You couldn't have known. Most species don't have warfare traditions like ours. That's just it, Professor Zethkari said. I'm beginning to realize that what you described wasn't just different from our traditions. It was different from what most beings would consider warfare at all. Sage, the Florian, had been quietly observing the conversation. Now he spoke up, with his gentle, plant-like voice. I've been thinking about what you said, Sage told Jake, about humans studying your own evil. In my culture, we believe that growth comes from understanding, but we never imagined applying that principle to understanding cruelty. It's not pleasant, Jake admitted, but it's necessary. If we don't understand how we became monsters, we can't prevent it from happening again. Ben and Stone, the Torn High cadets, had been standing quietly nearby. Now Ben spoke up with his slow, rocky voice. Your species fascinates us, Ben said. Our people measure time in centuries. We have seen many civilizations rise and fall, but we have never seen a species deliberately study its own darkness. Most species either deny their capacity for evil or embrace it, Stone added. Humans seem to have chosen a third path, acknowledging it while fighting against it. Jake was surprised by the insight. That's actually a pretty good way to put it. River moved closer, her telepathic abilities allowing her to sense Jake's emotional state more clearly than the others. You're lonely, she said suddenly, carrying all this knowledge, all this responsibility. It isolates you from the rest of us. Jake felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He hadn't realized how much the conversation had affected him emotionally. Every human is lonely in that way, he said, quietly. We know things about sapient nature that other species don't know, and that knowledge separates us from everyone else. But it also makes you valuable, Lyra said with growing understanding. Your isolation is the price you pay for being the galaxy's early warning system. Professor Zethkari looked around at his students with something approaching pride. Despite their shock and distress, they were working through the implications of what they had learned with remarkable maturity. I think, the professor said, we need to completely revise how this course covers human military history. This discussion has revealed gaps in our understanding that could have serious implications for galactic security. Jake looked alarmed. Professor, I didn't share this information to frighten anyone or to make humans seem more threatening. I know, Professor Zethkari replied. But the fact remains that the rest of the galaxy doesn't understand humans nearly as well as we thought we did, and misunderstanding between species has historically led to conflicts. River nodded in agreement. If other species knew what we learned today, they would either fear humans unnecessarily or trust them for the wrong reasons. That's exactly the problem, Jake said. Humans aren't monsters, but we're not saints either. We're dangerous beings trying very hard to be good. Understanding that distinction is crucial for anyone who has to work with us. Lyra began pacing again, her tactical mind working through the implications. This changes everything about human-alien cooperation, she said. We've been treating humans like any other peaceful species, but you're not peaceful at all. You're controlled. There's a difference, Jake agreed. A critical difference, Professor Zethkari added. Peaceful species can become dangerous if pushed too far. Controlled species are always dangerous, but they've chosen to direct that danger constructively. As the group continued their discussion, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationships with his classmates. The easy friendship was gone, replaced by something more complex, but perhaps more honest. They would never again see him as just another cadet. They would always know what he represented, the controlled violence of humanity, the species that had learned to fear itself. But perhaps that was better. Perhaps honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the foundation for real trust between species. Jake touched his covered forearm one more time, feeling the small raised area where his grandfather's blood stain lay embedded under his skin, the mark that reminded him every day of what humans were capable of when they forgot to be afraid of themselves. As his classmates finally began to leave, heading back to their dormitories to process what they had learned, Jake remained in the empty classroom with Professor Zethkari. "Are you all right, Cadet Morrison?" the professor asked. Jake considered the question. Was he all right? He had just revealed humanity's darkest secrets to beings who had never imagined such cruelty was possible. He had seen fear and horror in the eyes of people he considered friends, but he had also seen understanding, and perhaps that was worth the cost. "I'm all right, Professor," Jake said finally. This conversation needed to happen. They needed to understand what they're working with. Professor Zethkari nodded slowly. Indeed they did. And now we all have to live with that knowledge. Jake gathered his things and headed for the door, but the professor's voice stopped him. "Cadet Morrison, thank you for your honesty, for your courage in sharing something so difficult, and for carrying that burden so the rest of us don't have to." Jake nodded and left the classroom, walking through the alien architecture of the academy, toward his dormitory. Behind him, he could feel the weight of changed relationships, altered perceptions, and the heavy responsibility of representing a species that had learned to distrust itself. But ahead of him lay the possibility of real understanding between species, the kind of understanding that could only come from acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Jake touched his bloodstain one more time and whispered the words his grandfather had taught him. Never again. It was both a promise and a warning. And now, for the first time, he wasn't the only one who understood what it meant.